Assalamu alaikum, dear listeners and watchers of Khanversations. Welcome to the third edition of Conversations about the Quran 2021. Today we have an incredibly distinguished scholar, Professor Carl Ernst, the William R. Kennan Distinguished Professor from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill with us. But before we go there, let me thank all of you who support Khanversations, spiritually, materially, and otherwise. I would also ask you all to subscribe to the channel, like this video, make your comments, everything that is necessary to make me thrive on the YouTube media. Going forward, we will have only one more episode in this Ramadan. There are other episodes from the previous Ramadan that you can watch, and the links are below. Today we are talking to Professor Carl Ernst in the context of this fantastic book. It is called How to Read the Quran, and he has looked at the Quran from a very innovative perspective, at least for practicing and believing Muslims. A lot of the stuff in the book would be eye-opening and fascinating. So without further delaying, let me invite Professor Ernst to Khanversations. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much indeed.
I'm really honored because I have, even though I've not studied with you, I consider myself as your student. And that doesn't mean that you are to blame for my flaws, but I learned a lot from your book on Sufism while writing my own book on Ihsan. That was a starting point, and I found a lot of interesting things. And of course, this book was truly eye-opening for me. And so from that perspective, I want to start by asking a very simple question. You do mention that you approach the Quran as a literary text, and your treatment is very sympathetic. There is no bias or anything against it at all. You do emphasize that you have put aside the question of its divine origins. But my question to you is it possible for people to consider the Quran as having divine origins and without necessarily then converting to Islam? Is it the issue of, okay, if you think it's God's message, then why aren't you a Muslim? You know, Esposito keeps telling me that people ask him that question all the time. You know so much about Islam, so why haven't you converted to Islam as a logical question? Is that a reason why sincere scholars of the Quran hesitate to acknowledge it as a divine text?
Well, I think that, for one thing, the Quran itself alludes to the possibility of an outsider being the Rahban, the monks who become moved to tears by the Quran. That's a very memorable passage. So I think it can be appreciated and appreciated on a deep level by outsiders. But I have another point of view about this, which is in the study of religion as an academic study, it is my hope that we can create a public space where it is possible for anyone to participate without having to pay the price of conversion. In other words, it should be possible for us to appreciate on a deep level the religions of other people without having to join, in effect. Because the alternative is that we would have walls of separation that would be impenetrable. And that is not something I would look forward to.
You are sitting very comfortably in the academia, and it is from that perspective what you're saying makes a little sense. I mean, there's no disagreement from that. Like, I don't have to be a post-structuralist to read Foucault and critique him or engage with him, right? I could be someone who has an entirely different epistemological perspective. However, but we are in a very strange era that I don't think there was ever a moment in history where there were so many non-Muslims who knew more about Islam and the Quran and others than many practicing, believing Muslims, isn't it? There are thousands of scholars who I think probably know more about different aspects of Islamic law. I mean, one of the most prominent scholars of Islamic Sharia, Wail Allah, today is also appreciated by Muslims so much. He has so many Muslim students and so on.
Yes,
So,
yes.
given this period, I find your position very fascinating. Don't you think so?
Well, you're right. I mean, I am in a very privileged position as a member of the professoriate in the academy, and I'm grateful for the opportunities that I've had, and I'm also especially grateful for the contacts I've had in Muslim majority countries and the generosity with which I've been received in many different places. The problem that we have is that the Quran has been excluded from the consideration of intellectuals for many centuries in the history of Europe and later America. And even though you're quite right, there's been some great progress made in recent years. There are many people for whom the Quran is a foreign territory. It's surrounded by an aura of negativity. And, to give you a blunt example, there were people who wanted to burn the Quran and put it on trial for crimes against humanity not too many years ago. So in proposing that the Quran can be considered as literature, this is a gesture to offer non-Muslims an avenue to appreciate the Quran without having to declare loyalties one way or the other. So, in other words, it is, in a sense, perhaps a kind of a strategic move to say, let's take a look at the text, to invite people in and give them a chance to have a fair appreciation of it without the negativity they have been taught. And so then after that, of course, people can decide what they like, but it has not been part of the curriculum. And so this is one way to get it in a position where people can give it a fair-minded consideration.
Do you ever encounter this feeling from Muslims as if Muslims own the Quran, as the Quran belongs to Muslims, and therefore you are encroaching upon them? Because God didn't send the Quran to Muslims. He sent it to everybody. In fact, there was only one Muslim at the time it started its revelation, isn't it? It was basically addressing non-Muslims. So in that sense, I think we have lost that original intent that the Quran speaks to everybody.
Right. Well, one of the objectives of my book was also to try to make it possible to imagine how the first audience received it, and to look at the unfolding of the text as it was delivered, as we are told, over 23 years to the Prophet. And so the first sections of the Quran have a particular content, and these are the so-called Meccan Surahs. And the later surahs have a different kind of a presentation. So how do they experience that? And just to give you one example, the term Quran occurs as a word in surahs that are relatively early in the delivery of the text. So when the word Quran was first mentioned to the believers in Mecca, it did not mean the complete text as we have it now. So how did they experience that unfolding? That's one thing I wanted to try to get people to experience.
You know, in that particular argument that you make, you call it one of the four elements of your book, which is development of the language itself. Yes. So nobody in the first year or two of the revelation of the Quran, nobody knew how long the Quran was going to be, what would be the themes, what will even be the purpose of the text, right?
Right.
In fact, the earliest of revelations were just God talking to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him.
Right.
So I understand, I found it very fascinating to say that as time passed, the companions of the Prophet who first heard say Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi, the 96th surah, their understanding of the same surah would have changed in the context of other revelations, isn't it?
That's right. And we have a notion in traditional Islamic scholarship that in certain surahs there are ayahs that came later and were inserted afterward. And without necessarily replicating that traditional scholarship, modern academics who are looking at the text of the Quran have postulated that the early Meccan surahs have typically many different rhymes that are very striking, and it changes, it shifts as you move through a particular surah. The lines are short, they're dense, they have a strong rhythmic quality, and you can go on about the literary characteristics. Whereas if you look at Surah Al-Baqarah, which is relatively late, each ayah is a whole paragraph long. And the end rhyme is a simple plural verb or noun. And so they have a very different texture to them. So that deserves to be discussed, and that is one of the approaches that we can take.
You emphasize several times in the beginning, I mean, obviously in your introduction to the book and subsequently also, that your approach is both literary and historical.
Yeah.
So some of the things that you look at, I mean, I've been interacting with the Quran since I was born, nearly for more than half a century, right? But I have never looked at it the way you were looking at. Like, for example, I did not look at the structure of the surahs, like how they rhyme and how they are. So I had this feeling that because you were not focusing on the content of the message, right? The meaning of what the Quran was saying, you were looking at the envelope and not the letter in the envelope. Would you agree with that?
Well, not entirely. I mean, structure is essential to the understanding of a text. And I would propose that the Quran is not one random thing after another. And one of the things that literary scholars have emphasized is that there is often a double or a triple structure in a surah, that there is a unity in the composition of the surah itself. And this is something which has also been picked up by authors such as Islahi and Sayyid Qutb and others in modern times, although it's not typically been a part of the traditional Tafsir exegesis. But if the beginning and the end match up with each other, and in fact, if the vocabulary is repeated, that can't be treated as an accident. And so this helps us to understand what the point is of any particular surah. So I think it actually helps us better to understand the meaning of a text. The alternative is to sort of pick verses out in a sort of isolated fashion and to assemble them in a subject-oriented manner to try to resolve what is the Quranic position on a particular topic. And that is attractive to people who have an argument to make, either in terms of theology or law or something similar. So they would assemble the quotations in a way that would advance a particular interpretation. So that's a different point of view.
That is God's way of highlighting what he's emphasizing in a way, right? In the Quran, by opening and closing with those issues. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Well, it's intrinsically as a part of the text. And the same thing has been observed with respect to many ancient literatures, where the beginning and the end will have a linkage in the actual words that are used. So this is not something that you're making up. And today, in the modern world, we actually don't recognize that very easily because we've been trained in a more linear way of thinking. And so this notion of the circularity of the text is something that we have to relearn.
what do you mean by the ring structure of the Quran? Like,
Well, the ring structure means that, as I mentioned, the beginning and the end link up together. And I mean, I can give you a short example from the Hebrew Bible, where in the book of Numbers, the Israelites say, if only we had died when we were in the wilderness, when we were wandering, if only we had died. So the beginning and the end are exactly the same words, and the two intervening verses in the center are kind of parallel to each other. And there's something kind of satisfying about that. And I've pointed out, we have some scholars who have done work even on the more complex works like surahs such as Al-Ma'idah, Surah 5, and Surah Al-Baqarah itself can be analyzed in this way. And I did a version of this on Surah 60, Mumtahana, where we see that the beginning and the end, and there are rings within rings. And I mean, we don't have time to go through a demonstration today, but the center of the ring structure is the point. And this helps us understand what is the message. It often is in contrast with the beginning and the ending, with some tension there. So I would invite more curious readers to take a look at this to see what.
While reading the arguments, to me, the importance of understanding the structure of the Quran was emphasized when you discussed the controversy about the satanic verses.
That's right.
And so I was wondering if you could, for my audience, say, because you ultimately conclude that the story of the satanic verses is probably false, and you derive that from the structure.
That's right. Now, so one of the points that I'm observing there in Surah 53, An-Najm, is that the verses that are said to have been involved with the satanic verses incident are they're very long and argumentative, and they don't fit the pattern of the verses around them. So they have the appearance of a later insertion. And the story about the satanic verses is implausible to me. I think it was invented for other reasons. In other words, it was a romantic story about, look, things almost went wrong, but at the last minute, the prophet was saved. And so it's kind of a storyteller's approach, but it is so out of touch with the rest of Surah 53, which is where you have the allusion to the ascension experience and the notion that you could have, al-gharaniq, these
cranes.
The cranes coming in is just it's not a theological issue. For me, it's a literary issue. It doesn't fit, and it just has the clear signs of a forgery in a sense. The story was fiction, and it was extreme popular fiction, and that's how I would regard it.
Surah Al-Najm is to me, as a believer, it is one of the most profoundest. This is referring to the encounter, the only encounter between Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and God. and 2 verses or 3 verses after that, you suddenly have these verses about.
It doesn't make sense. And if people would have noticed this, it's a fairly early passage, and I just don't think it stands up historically.
After reading your book, and you make this very interesting point as to how the book is, it's an oral tradition that needs to be listened to, we've been listening to Qira'at and Quran, and I recognize it when I read the Quran, And some verses they just flow when you recite, and then you come across suddenly a very long verse, and then the structure is suddenly different. And from your book, I realized that okay, these are examples of those later revelations which were inserted in the surahs, some even 10 years apart.
Right. So when we come across a verse where, for instance, and above them are 19.
Yeah.
And then the next verse is like a whole paragraph. It's huge. And then it goes back to these short poetic verses. I can easily imagine somebody saying, wait a minute, what? 19 what? And so the revelation was expanded in a subsequent delivery. That seems to be more believable, more plausible than to think that it was originally written in such an inconsistent fashion, that it was delivered in such a consistent fashion.
You know, one of the things that I found very interesting about your argument is that your distinction about the chronological revelation as opposed to how the Quran has been currently compiled. And so you have this very interesting chart in which you actually list. It's very useful. I remember in graduate school desperately trying to find, to get a sense of how. But what was to me very interesting is that isn't that compilation itself as to what is the chronological sequence, isn't that coming from the literature on Asbab al-Nuzul and the classical Tafsirs, or is there any other way in which you can determine that?
The modern scholarly literature does look at the Asbab al-Nuzul, the occasions of revelation, but with also with a critical eye, because there is an argument that, you know, if you have a particular passage that seems to be difficult to understand, sometimes it is easy for people to invent an explanation that fits it, or that supplies details that people are curious about. Mm-hmm. And there may have been a knowledge earlier, but has been forgotten. I mean, one example is in the Surah Al-Kahf. We have the sleepers, and they have a dog.
Yeah.
So some people said, well, what's the name of the dog? And one commentators came up and they said, well, it was Qutmir. Now, I don't know exactly where that came from, but there's a temptation to fill in the gaps. And so some of the Asbab al-Nuzul could easily be plausible stories that were invented at a particular time. So that's not necessarily where one begins.
So you are suggesting that it is the structure which are more indicative of chronology rather than. I mean, I can understand that by looking at the structure of the surah, you can say this is a Meccan and this is a Medinan surah, which is pretty obvious. But what about which is the 43rd and which is the 42nd surah?
Yeah, there's obviously room for flexibility on this. It is a tool, and it has a reference to a historical period. And so without being overly dogmatic about whether one surah is ahead of another one, I think it allows us to distinguish different styles and modes of presentation in the Quran in a way that makes sense. And so it's a stylistic argument.
Well, from an academic perspective, on a couple of places you use the word post-Orientalist to describe your approach. But one of the key tools that you use is the chronological revelation of the Quran developed by a scholar 150 years. Wouldn't he be an Orientalist, or would?
Well, that's true, but when I say post-Orientalist, let's define it, Orientalism. It means that there is something called the East that is different from the West. And also there's a judgment involved that the East is superstitious, non-scientific, non-modern, needs to be brought into the modern world. there's a lot of negativities involved with that. And also the Quran must be a foreign text. It has no connection to the European and American culture. And it's derivative, and it goes on and on. Let's just set that aside. It's not defensible. It's not part of the way we train scholars today. And in fact, my undergraduates, get a very different approach. The Quran is connected to the biblical texts, and that's something we haven't talked about, but the Quran looks very closely at the Gospel and the Torah, and in some cases revises texts that are being quoted. And it's intimately familiar with a whole series of textual sources going back to not only to the Torah, but to the Talmud, to some of the Revelation literature that didn't make it into the Christian Bible, and so forth. And so it's part of a tradition that we can identify with. And by making it accessible in terms of style and rhetoric, then it becomes something that people can appreciate without this negativity and so forth. I would say that the reason why we follow or we take as a basis the analysis of Noldeke is that he was part of a whole movement that was looking at the Bible and the literature of the Greek classics in the same methodological approach. In other words, it's a literary and historical approach to these texts. And although Noldeke may have had his shortcomings, nevertheless, this is a really dynamic piece of work that opens up a new line of investigation, which is not defined by prejudice.
No, I understand. I think it is a powerful idea, and I think it is important that I think at least Muslim scholars of the Quran, and even those who are using the Quran to derive legal rulings and articulate Sharia, should actually try to look at the Quran in terms of as a historically evolving document over a period of 23 years. And if they look at it in a chronological fashion, I have a feeling that their understanding of the Islamic law could actually be very different from what it is. So when they start with Surah Al-Baqarah and move down, and Surah Al-Ma'idah is probably the last surah that was revealed, and it is, there's a lot of contentious discussions in the surah, and so right. If you so I understand that very interestingly, but I don't know whether you're familiar. In my first series on Khanversations, I spoke with Dr. Safi Kaskas, who has translated the Quran with references to the Bible. And so he has about 3,000 footnotes in that. In fact, I will ask him to send you a copy of that, of his English translation. So the point that you make about intertextuality is, I mean, it not only deconstructs this idea of Orientalism, but they, at least to Muslims, we are familiar that many of the stories in the Quran are also biblical in nature. I mean, the references to the prophets. But what are the most striking findings that you discovered while doing the intertextual studies?
Well, one of the things that is very apparent is that the Quran is addressing an audience that knew a lot of these earlier texts. In other words, by when the Quran, for instance, refers to the two Israelite leaders who succeeded to go to the Promised Land, it doesn't mention their names. But everybody must have known it was Caleb and Joshua. So the Quran doesn't have to assume, does not have to tell the whole story. The Quran frequently says, you know the story of Pharaoh and Moses. And so this is assumed. So we have a number of really powerful examples. One, which is found in Surah Al-Ma'idah, is the prohibition of murder and the reference to Cain and Abel. And if one has killed a single soul, it is though, etc.
532,
this is quite clearly a reflection of a passage from the Talmud, and it's frequently the Quran will say, "As we revealed, as we wrote before," etc., which refers to earlier revelations. And some of the passages are rather obscure. For instance, the passage about Abraham take 4 birds and sacrifice them. Yeah. It's difficult to know what's going on there until you look at the text called the Apocalypse of Abraham. This is not a well-known document, but it did not make it into the Christian Bible. But there you have a story about Abraham ascending to heaven and birds, and it makes sense in terms of the way the Quran speaks. So I think the story of Mary is very profoundly engaged with a biblical text called the Infancy Gospel of James, which tells the story of the Virgin Mary at great length, and it's illustrated in many cathedrals in Italy and notably in Istanbul, in Constantinople, in the Karya Jami, where we have a whole mosaic depiction of the story of Mary, the same incidents that are described in the Quran. So this is a shared kind of history, and it becomes much more interesting to me, and I think to my students and readers, if they realize that this is an ongoing shared conversation, and therefore it strikes me that it's time for certain Christian groups to take the Quran seriously, which they haven't had to do because by sort of rejecting it completely, it got them off the hook. And likewise, I think that although there are notable examples of Quranic commentators who have engaged seriously with the text of the Bible, it's not been standard. And it could be much more productive if people acknowledge that there is a wider context in which these are connected.
You know, one of the points that you make in the book, which I found quite fascinating, was that you said that let us not project contemporary religious identities back onto the Quran. Right. So for example, if the Quran is referring to Yahud and Nasara, they're not necessarily the Christians and Jews that we are talking about today. And so, so could you share, I mean, you had a very interesting idea about that, you know, who the Quran was actually talking to.
Well, there's an interesting argument that was introduced by a historian at the University of Chicago that when the Quran refers to the believers, that during the time of the Prophet, this very well may have included people we call Christians, Jews, and others who were monotheists and acknowledged the leadership of the Prophet, but there had not yet been hard lines drawn between the different religious communities. And in fact, you know, on the scale of things, Islam in relation to Iman and Ihsan, and you've written about Ihsan, right? Islam is sort of on the lower level of social identity, whereas Ihsan is about the inner faith and experience. And so also treaties from the time indicate that, for instance, there's a treaty between the Umayyad Caliphate and the Georgian Christians, which recognizes them as believers. And so with that kind of information, then it seems interesting that perhaps for as late as decades, up until perhaps the time of Abdul Malik in the 690s, in the ferment that was created by the Prophet's mission and the religious messages that were delivered to all these different people in the Near East, that Ya ayyuhal mu'mineen could refer to people of different religious backgrounds. And so that is important for us to think about, because the lines of religious identity that we are familiar with today have not always been the same by any means. And even Islam itself has become important in relatively recent years during the colonial period in ways that it had not been before.
Yeah, I remember the book that you're talking about, where he emphasizes as to how even the caliphs were called Amirul Mu'mineen rather than Amirul Muslimin. So there were.
This is Professor Donner, Fred Donner.
Yes, yeah, Fred Donner, exactly. I actually read that book. I met a rabbi in Morocco, and I was telling him as to how I was talking about how I found the Jewish. I asked him basically why was the Jewish community so well integrated in the Moroccan society as opposed to other parts of the Arab world, and he said, "Do you know the king calls himself Amirul Mu'mineen, actually, the king of Morocco?" And he says, right. "I'm a believer of one God, so he's my Amir too. So we are automatically integrated because so that was an interesting and we had a long conversation. And I realized that it was not just a superficial allegiance; it was a very serious acknowledgement of the king of Morocco as the leader, because the king of Morocco recognized them as a co-equal religious community. But I was also talking about how you'd argue that there are so many references to Jews and Christians, but there were hardly any Christians identified in Medina, and so maybe so that's. Could you just explain what you meant by that? You call them Jewish Christians.
Well, there are a couple of things that I ended up realizing that I had discovered a question, but we without really being able to get to the answer. And one of them is the Sabians. And later on, after there was a period where a group of pagans who lived in Haran up in Syria declared that they were the Sabians, and so they got themselves some social protection by claiming that identity. But when I refer to, some scholars think it was actually Jewish Christians, which means a community that followed Jewish law, but accepted Jesus as the Messiah. And there were certainly several examples of that in antiquity. But the real kind of mystery that I couldn't solve was the discrepancy between the Sirah, the biography of the Prophet, and the Quran when it comes to describing the Medinan period. Because in the biography in Ibn Ishaq and allied materials, we are told about the story of the Jewish tribes of Medina, the gradual frictions and conflicts that developed, and so forth. However, if we look at the surahs that are identified as primarily Medina-based, particularly 2, 4, 5, the religious content of that is primarily directed against Christians in terms of a debate. But also there are passages that are linked to fundamental rituals of Christian churches. In other words, we have a passage that is addressed to the Virgin Mary that mirrors the biblical passage called the Magnificat in the Latin phrase. And this is one of the central canticles of the Eastern churches that is recited ritually every day. And there is another one, which is also, there's a second piece of this ritual text that is referred to in the Quran very closely as well. So this invites the conclusion that the Quran is referring to rituals that people know very well because they're watching them go on in Medina. But the biography does not tell us about a Christian community in Medina. So I would tend to lean on the Quran as being definitive, and that the Sirah, which is composed a century later, uh, it's a complex book and it has its agendas. And there's a whole concept of prophecy which is being developed. And it was the concluding part of a biographical treatment of all of the prophets going back to Adam, much of which has disappeared. So I tend to think that there is more going on in Medina than we know from the biographies, and that there may have been a presence of Christians there that, well, I just don't know how to understand the Quranic passages without that.
No, that's very interesting, and it does raise the question as to how, when I read the traditional commentators, whether it's Tabari or Ibn Kathir, especially some of the later, the 8th, 9th century Mufassirs, the thing that is strikingly, and I found it quite irritating consistently, is the attitude that, well, I have understood the Quran, and now I'm going to explain it to you. And so
wow, yeah, that's true. Yeah. Well, you might want to look at some of the Sufi commentators, because they have an interesting method. This is found in, for instance, Solami and Qushayri and Ruzbahan, where they say, well, on this ayah, Sahle Tostari says it means this, but Hossein Mansour al-Hallaj says it means that. And it could mean something, and they'll give you 5 or 10 different explanations, and it's sort of like, it's open.
I mean, I've been reading to study also, but one of the problems with Sufi commentaries are they're not as comprehensive, in the sense they don't talk about every verse, and they are not as well documented as, say, Tabari or I have this very strange relationship with Ibn Kathir. I don't like wherever he makes his personal interventions, but his scholarship is impeccable. I mean, he connects the Quran to other verses of the Quran in an incredible way, and he also has a very deep knowledge of the Hadith literature. So he's able to.
Well, that's true.
But he does he's very judgmental, and he's trying to. It's very clear that he's trying to impose his view. So, for example, the same verse that appears in Baqarah and Maida, which talks about Sabians, Jews, and Christians, right?
Yes.
So if you look at Tabari, he's trying to figure out who the Jews and Christians and Sabians in Medina are at that time. He spent so much time trying to figure those out. And in the end, he says that this is God's promise, that these people will get maghfirah or salvation, and God never breaks his promises. Whereas Tabari starts by saying, this is abrogated. That's his first sentence.
So abrogation. No, I have a problem with abrogation, I must say. Because
what is your view of abrogation?
Well, I think it's an attempt by theologians and legal scholars to apply a consistency to the Quran by saying that the later verse will, if it's in conflict with an earlier verse, then it cancels that one out. And I have a problem with that, because it means you're not supposed to take seriously the earlier verse.
Yeah.
And you have to be awfully sure of yourself to do that. And so I think it's a way for scholars to avoid problems of tension between two parts of a text, which could certainly exist.
Yeah, but in Surah Al-Baqarah, the Quran itself says that God does not reveal anything new unless it reaffirms what it has revealed first, or reveals something better. So at the minimum, the abrogating verse is equal to the abrogated verse, if not adding more to it. So I don't think that the legalistic interpretation of abrogation is the same. Some people have used the same theory to say the Quran abrogates the Bible, and so on and so forth.
Well, there's that. Yeah, no, that's right. Well, but as far as one verse negating another, how often do you want to have God changing his mind?
I have a question. Given your profound knowledge of Sufi tradition and Sufism, and your book is incredible. I really enjoyed it. I've read it more than once, and I've used it. I teach a class on Introduction to Sufism, and I use your book.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah, sometimes I use your book. Sometimes I use The Vision of Islam by Professor William Chittick. So it depends on the students. So I've read the book, but I wanted to ask you, I don't see that understanding of Sufism reflected in your book on how to read the Quran.
Well, you can't do everything in one book. And I've been thinking, I'm working on another project right now, which is about the Arabic writings of Muslims who were enslaved in America, which is really an amazing subject. But I have also been looking at, in Pakistan, there's a research center called the Iran-Pakistan Center for Persian Studies, and they publish catalogs of all the Persian manuscripts in Pakistan. And in the section on Quranic commentary, they have well over 100 works listed that, to my knowledge, have never been discussed in any scholarship of contemporary, and sometimes these are, rare works and so forth. There's a wonderful looking one, which I have a copy of, called Habib al-Haqa'iq, written by a Sufi of Lahore from the 17th century. And it's a discussion of how the Quran is used throughout the Sufi practice. And nobody has looked at this kind of work. But it strikes me that there's a rich amount of material out there, which is sadly underestimated. And so you have identified a very important issue, and it needs to be pursued.
My son's name is Rumi. So Rumi and I were in the library, and we were looking for books. I was looking for books, and he was browsing. He was a little kid, maybe 8 or 10 years old, and then said, "Abba, look at this book," and he was laughing at it. So it was Sir al-Asrar, the book, The Secret of Secrets, and it was a collection of Abdul Qadir Jilani's discourses. So I said, "What's funny about it?" Because he didn't know it was Abdul Qadir Jilani. And I said, "So what's funny?" He said, "Abba, if it's in the library, how can it be secret, right? Everybody knows about it. So how can it be secret of secrets?" So I took the book and we browsed it to see what secrets were there. And it was very interesting. He had a short commentary on the verses of the Quran, لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ. We have created the human being in the best of models, and then we have sent him down to the lowest of the low. So I read other commentaries on that verses, and they often talk about how the human being has this potential to rise up, but we also can succumb down. So there is an angel and a beast inside each one of us, and we have to strive to become the better. But when I was reading Abdul Qadir Jilani, he says these verses refer to the story of Adam, because Adam, who was created by God as the best of all, and it was he who was sent down to earth, the lowest. So the commentary is completely,
interesting.
So at that moment, I remember acknowledging that yes, the Sufis could have irfan about the Quran, so they could have insights about the revelation. So in that sense, since that moment, I've been quite fascinated with Sufi commentaries on the Quran, and unfortunately, they're not systematic, right? And they are, I guess, because of the inspirational necessity, I guess.
Well, there are traditions of interpretation, and honestly, it is an area which has been only little explored. But for instance, I would recommend to you the work that's been done on the Persian Tafsir of Mebudi, the Kashf al-Asrar. It's been translated by Chittick.
Yes.
The Irfan parts of it, and it's also been discussed by others. So, but we don't know very much about them. But if you take some of these interpretations of Ibn Arabi, so for instance, كل شيء حالك إلا وجهه. Everything is perishing except for his face.
Yeah.
So the normal way you would interpret that is everything is going to perish except for the face of God, right?
Mm-hmm.
Ibn Arabi says, wait a minute. Everything is perishing except for its face. We all have an aspect which is a face, which is a wajh, which is turned towards God. And that is our eternal aspect. He argues that this is a literal interpretation. And it certainly opens up a different aspect.
Yes, I mean, that means each one of us has an eternal side to it, right?
That's what he was implying, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I have his commentary here, Ibn Arabi's, and I mean, it's so tiny, but it's mind-blowing. There's no doubt about it. His commentary on the Quran, yeah.
So we don't know the history of the Quran interpretation yet. It's still buried in manuscripts.
Yeah. I mean, I'm extremely grateful to you for giving the time to talk to me, and also for your wonderful book. I hope more people read it, and I wish you all the best in your future endeavors. Please count me as one of your students, and please come back again, and we will talk about your other projects too. So
thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation, and I wish all the best to you and to your audience.
Thank you very much, Professor.